10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 429. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 429 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. It's the last episode of the month of October, so you know what that means. We do our tune of the month. I've got an etude for you, and we'll kind of wrap up our work on the fantastic tune, Are You Lonesome Tonight? So we've talked about a whole bunch of stuff. I had you learn the melody by ear. This is one of those, what I think of as like true jazz standards, where we're taking something from like another genre that wasn't written for jazz musicians, and we're kind of making it our own. So we talked about learning the melody, then I gave you the chords, and I mentioned a couple of really, really important parts of the harmony that I think are really important to outline and sort of like catch and be able to reflect in your playing. And then last week, we talked about remembering to incorporate the blues. And I think that that's really, really important. So what I tried to do with this etude is basically encompass a whole bunch of that stuff. So you're going to hear the blues being used pretty heavily. If you go to those spots that I was mentioning in episode 427, you're going to find a lot of stuff happening in those sections that really does reflect the chord changes. So this etude is kind of like a culmination of everything we've talked about, and that's generally the way that we like it. Now, the other thing that I've done with this etude that I feel is actually really important to mention is that I really tried to lean heavily into motive-based phrasing here. So I think what you're going to find is that there's a ton of repetitive stuff in this etude. And sometimes, kind of just the way it worked out, you know, the way that I write these etudes is I kind of go phrase by phrase, but I always have my saxophone in my hands, and I'm always trying to decide, like, what would I normally play here? Because what I don't want is for the etude to not be me, right? I want it to reflect my style of playing. And I think that that's sort of what's advantageous about etudes from different people out there, is that when you take their etude and you practice it and you learn it, it's like you're getting a little bit of their brain, but just in a composition instead of an exercise kind of thing, like what they would actually play in a solo. So as I was doing that, the one thought that was kind of in my mind was, if I were to play over this and I were to really take the approach that I want to play very motivically, what would happen? And that's kind of what I based the whole thing on top of trying to make sure that we got the blues in there, which wasn't hard because I play the blues over tunes like this all the time. And then those other sections too, it wasn't that hard to get like some real harmonic clarity because, again, that's what I would sort of normally do on those sections of the tune. But the motive stuff, I want you to really, really study carefully where some of that stuff happens. Because some of it is super obvious and you'll hear it when we listen to it. It's like right there, like, oh, okay, clearly that's a motive that he just wanted to hang on to and carry over, you know, through the phrase. But then other times, what I tried to do, and I work on this in my own playing a lot, is bring back a nod to something that I played earlier, but a little bit later in the solo, right? So it's like motive, 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 and then I move away from it, but then maybe a couple bars later, actually come back to it, right? And you hear that again. And I think that's such an effective tool for the improviser to kind of work on, because what it does is it gives your listener, especially if they're really, really listening and like focusing on what you're doing, it really provides like this really cool aspect to a solo. Wait, did I hear that before? Oh, I think I remember that from earlier in the solo. And it kind of gives the listener like a little bit of structure and a little bit of something that they can latch on to in your solo. And that's kind of the whole argument for motive-based playing anyway, is that we want to get away from just like, running all these notes and the listener being like almost overwhelmed, even the experienced listener being kind of overwhelmed, and just give them some structure and something to latch onto. Okay, I've talked enough. Let's listen to the etude, then we'll chat for a minute after, and then we'll get out of here. Here's the etude. All right, so there it is. And I think probably a lot of that motivic stuff just like sort of hit you in the face. There's no way to avoid it. Oh, there's a bunch of stuff that's kind of repeated and over again. And I can hear the through line between that phrase. But I do want you to look at it through that sort of exploring the motivic development and really trying to excavate a bunch of that. Because on a tune like this, where the changes are pretty simple, I mean, this is not confirmation, right? So the chords are pretty spread out. It lends itself to a more like open, less notey kind of style of playing. So I think the motivic stuff is really important, and that's kind of what I'll leave you with this month. So as always, the Patreon members will get a copy of that etude in B flat, E flat concert, and bass clef. Along with a file where you can adjust the ranges and do whatever's appropriate for your instrument or your abilities. And the $5 members will also get that etude demo track to play along with. Now, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, maybe you're new to the show, we're a listener-supported podcast. We don't do any ads on this show, so we really rely on people like you that get something out of this show to support us and keep us going. And we do that through the Patreon platform and small monthly donations. In return for that, you get all these jazz education materials that you can put in your library and come back to whenever you want. So if you want to know more information about that, go to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, or go to patreon.com and search for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson podcast, and you'll get all the info. You'll be able to sign up and get instant access. Quick shout out to one new patron this week. Thank you to Howard for signing up to becoming a part of the family. And of course, to the almost 400 members we have over there, thanks. We really couldn't do this without you. So again, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, or patreon.com, search for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson podcast. And we really appreciate that support. It does keep us going. All right, everybody. Hope you have a great end of the month, and we will see you next time with a brand new series. Bye.